Hello, let's create a groom using Ornatrix standalone application, which is a software currently in beta and available for testing to anyone. So you can apply by going down to the link in the description. Today I just wanted to create another groom. The software is evolving very fast, and there are many new features that I can list, or I'll just show the features along the way as I'm making the groom. So today, because the June 3 is coming out, I thought maybe we can do this type of groom from Timothee Chalamet. I picked this one because it's not long hair like we did before. It's medium hair. It has interesting detail inside the groom itself. Like you have sub clumps, for example, with clumps. I can see it has an interesting flow of the hair, so it combines like curliness together with like direction hair that goes in specific direction. So I think it's interesting to recreate in Ornatrix. So to start, I'm just going to go to File, and I'm going to go to New from Template and use the Empty Scalp template. So what this does is just opens or rather creates a new scene, but inside the scene you already have this character bust, and you have a pre-fitted scalp on top of this bust. So it's very easy and good thing to start quickly, right? You can, of course, start from a completely new scene and import your model. This is perfectly fine as well. So, but this is just in case you don't care about the model itself, you just want to make the groom like we do right now. So first, I'm going to go to this groom preset option, and I'm just going to choose the basic groom. Double click to create. And as you see, it took this groom that we had before, and it added on top of it, it used the scalp surface here, and added on top of this a bunch of operators, which we could add by hand. But this just is much faster when like we have a preset that adds the necessary ones. So first thing is I'm going to go down to guides from mesh, and I'm just going to reduce the length of the hair. I'm just going to use the image here as the reference. By the way, this is probably going to be, again, a longer form tutorial because I'm just going to go through the process and in some cases probably speed up the video. But generally, I think this is a good approach to take for this kind of groom, and we're just going to try to do it the proper way. So first, I'm going to select the length. And one other important thing to know is, again, because it's beta software, not that it crashes a lot or anything, but it's always good to be a little bit protected. So there is an autosave every 5 minutes if you do nothing. But a lot can happen in 5 minutes, especially in this tutorial. So you can also use Control Alt and H button to hold the scene. This does the same thing, like for example as 3ds Max. This just saves the scene into like a temporary location, and later you can use the Control Alt F button to reload it from that temporary location without having to specify a file name, for example. So first I'm going to go to change width operator, and in here the width is currently, you see, kind of tapered off. Right, from root to tip, it goes smoothly more thinner and thinner, which is not really ideal. So I'm just gonna drag this to the top. So we still kind of have the little bit more fluffy roots, fluffy tips, but at the same time, the width of each strand is more or less constant along the length of the strand. You can, of course, just have it as full, right click and use the full option for hairs that are more coarse, like like you would have on a brush, for example. So at the moment I don't like the color of the hair. I don't think it's close to a reference, so you can find it here, the object color, and change it. So I'm just gonna change it to something that resembles our groom just a little bit more. Right, so maybe just a little bit, just a tad darker. And by the way, this groom object we no longer need, so I'm just going to select and delete it. And the new hair that we added from the preset, I'm just going to drag and drop under the character bust to create like a transform parent. But this step is not needed, but it's a good idea to do in general. So next, what I want to do is I want to change the shape of the strands. I want to direct the hair into the form that it should be. And I think I'm going to do this on guides level. So right before hair from guides, while we still have the guides, I'm going to, you can either add surface comp operator, or you can select the edit surface comp edit sinks tool here. And once you do, you can click and drag to create sinks. By default, the sinks are only going to be by the way, after you create it, you can also change the position, and you can change the direction by pressing on the sink or the root of the sink, the tip or the root. So currently the tip doesn't matter how long it is, the sink itself, the hair is still always the same length. But what we can do is we can go down to the sink orientation section and check this affect whole strand option. So when you do that, you see that I make the sink longer and the hairs are also becoming longer. So this way I can control both the shape and the length of the strands using sinks, right? So I think the hair kind of goes back here. It goes back and then it goes to the sides, right? There was another interesting photo. Yeah, this one I think is more interesting because you can see some of the hair falls onto his face, and I think this looks actually more interesting. So sideways, in the back it goes back. You see it's longer in front, right? I think it's a bit shorter on the sides, not too much, but definitely on the back it's shorter. So first we're gonna make it go back like this, then on each side, this here it goes down, here it goes down as well. In the back it goes back down like this, and here we can add another sink, but we can make the hair shorter. So let me just move this down a little bit more. So the hairs kind of cascade down instead of being all the same length. Okay, and I think we also need ones here, so it goes on the side. It's not too important to get this completely right, because you can always go back and edit the sinks. And this is actually one of the cool things about Ornatrix, is that using procedural workflow like this, where you don't use a lot of brushes, for example, allows you to go and make corrections very easily later on. So if you go to hair from guides operator, right now you can see how it interpolates between all the hairs evenly, which is kind of problematic because in the reference here, he has a part. So you see the hair here and the hair here, they don't interpolate, they don't go smoothly like this. We have to make this kind of same effect. So I can do this by going to edit guides, and I'm going to find the point approximately where I want it to happen. So I think it's here. In the toolbar, I'm going to select the edit strands tool, and I'm going to drag and select one side of the hairs. Right. I'm going to uncheck this ignore occluded option, so it selects also the hairs on the back of our character. I'm going to select all the strands. And here I'm going to use the assign unique group button, so that these strands are separated from the ones on the other side. You can see this by looking at the color of the strands. So next, I'm going to go to hair from guides, and in here down to my operator parameter settings, and find an option called parting automatic use strand groups. So when we do that, you see that the strands on each side no longer interpolate between each other. So at this point, let's see what our hair would look like in a render, right? So not too good, spoiler alert, it's going to be still pretty crappy, but I can use F3 button to switch to our basic ray traced view, and I can use the F4 button to switch to cycles render. So this is more like a beauty shot, so if you need like really detailed image, this is the one you use. And you would use F3 to kind of go in between like a viewport rasterized graphics into ray traced graphics. So here we have Radeon Pro rendering our hairs. And currently you can see that there are too few, right? If we go to hair from guides, you see the root count option here. It's set to 10,000. So right now we have 10,000 hairs being produced, and out of those 10,000, only 20% are previewed. So let's change the total amount of hairs, the render amount, to 100,000 to make it 10 times more. And previous strand fraction, we can set to 10%. I think it's good. And the difference is, right, so if I go here, what we see right now is 10% of the hair. If you want to see 100%, you go here to the top right of the toolbar, and you have this render mode button. You can also press F10 for this button. When I press it, we get the final render super dense hair. And as you see now, if I, for example, switch to cycles view, it's really very uniform. It's lacking detail and all that other stuff, but we have hair, right? So I'm gonna go back to our shaded preview. I'm gonna turn off the render button here, so we still see a good approximation of the hair, but it's not the final hair, so obviously it's gonna be much faster to work with. I'm gonna go above my edit sinks operator, and here add a curl operator. You can type in curl, right, and select this one, or you can also, you will have here a list of recently used operators, and you can find curl here, right? So this is really useful because it's like a contextual list based on the each specific operator, which gives you the most used operators that were created after it historically, right? So the curl right now exposes a problem that we don't have enough segments per strands. They're like jagged. We can fix this easily by going back to guides from mesh and increasing the point count here from 10 to, let's say, 50, right? So if you look down here, and we don't need the time view. If you look down here, you can see that you can see the statistics of the currently selected object. So here right now, because we are dealing with guides, there are 300 strands and 15,000 vertices. If we go and view the final hair output, there are 10,000 strands, which is exactly 10% of 100,000 that we specified, and there are 500,000 vertices. And also you can see other useful information, like for example, that this hair has varying width, which is true. It varies between root and tip. So this is information about your currently selected object, whether it's hair or mesh or whatever. Really useful. At this point, I'm going to go back to curl operator, and I'm going to play around with the parameters of the curl operator a little bit more to better match the reference image. So I can change the magnitude. I think it's a little bit like the curls are quite big, or rather, no, the curls are not too big, but the phase is not so much. You can increase or decrease stretch, right? So I think it's a little bit more curly at the tips of the character than at the base. I think we need another sink over here to control this part of the hair. Right, looks better. And I think we need sinks to model this part of the front of the like banks of the character. So here, right, it's kind of falling down on his face on both sides. What we can do is we can add sinks. So here, for example, I'm going to add a sink. And then on the other side, here, I guess. And for each individual sink, you can override some parameters. So these are global parameters down here. These control the behavior of the whole operator. So for example, I can change the bending values, like the bending of the strand shape along the, like at the base of the strand, as well as the tip of the strand. And here we have the global ramp for the slope, how much the operator affects the slope of the strands relative to the surface, right? So I can decrease it by for the global value, and then here for just this one selected sink over here, I can go and adjust its own slope, right? So here we're defining this slope specifically for one sink. All these parameters that you see here are kind of like overrides of global values per sink, right? So it's really useful if you want to control behavior at specific parts of your character. So for example, here we made the hair go down closer to the surface as opposed to the other strands. And I think this needs to be a bit longer. Right, a bit longer. So here on the other side, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to go and increase the bending a little bit along the strand, maybe like around here. And you can play around with this for a long time to refine and polish the character groom afterwards. So here you can see that the sink is on the wrong side of the parting plane that we had because we parted the strands. So I just need to bring it to the right side, and now it's the hairs snap into place. Here the hairs are interpolated, which is wrong. Here they're not because we have like a part going here. So let's go back and look at the final hair. At any point in any operator, you have three options. First is you can view the current operator, which is what we're doing, right? So here is the result of the curl operator and the final hair. To change this behavior, you can go here and use just the focused operator. So I can show the currently selected operator's output only. You can use the final output, so you always see the final result of your whole operator stack. Or you can you can do both like I did before. This is actually really useful for previewing right away the final result. So next thing that the hair is missing is clumping, and clumping usually adds a lot of character to the hair. So let's add a clump operator. Inside here, I'm going to go down. And by the way, I think it's about time that I saved my scene. So Control-Alt-H to hold. So this first clump operator is meant to create this like rougher, bigger clumps inside the hair. And then we'll create the smaller ones using sub-clumping. So we'll have another clump operator creating the small ones. As soon as I add the clump operator, if you expand the dynamic clumping option, you can set this to enable, and initially it will use like the current clump method, which is random. So it's going to use this count here to specify how many clumps you want to have. One of the issues that usually happen is you see how you have different hairs, for example, here, right, that are jumping onto the clump that like neighboring hairs clump. So for large clumps, this is not really ideal because you can see this is very obvious in big clumps. So here, what we can do is we can change the create method from random to guides and have the clump from the guides that we have at the bottom, right? So at this point, we may look at the clumps and say that they are a little bit, there are a little bit too many of them, right? The coarse, like the more rougher clumps are a bit bigger on our character. So what I can do, because we are now generating a clump for each of the guides that made the hair, is I can go back to guides from mesh and just reduce the number of guides. And because we have done everything so far in a kind of a procedural way, this is perfectly acceptable. You can continue changing things at the bottom of the stack, and they're going to appear non-destructively at the top of the final evaluation of your hair. So if I go here and I use the final option, we can see how the hair will look after everything is said and done. So here it's I can kind of just eyeball how big I want my clumps to be just by setting this root count parameter. And the good part about this, reusing the guides to create the big clumps, is that the guides is what we are applying curling on, right? So if you go to curl here and we display the guides at this point, each of the guides is curled separately, right? And this unique curl shape for each guide gets transferred onto the unique shape of each clump. And here, for example, we can play with the scale of the noise. And you can see that the clumps are kind of capturing what the guides are doing, right? Because they are being generated from the same source. So let's say I'm happy with something like this. Now I'm going to go back to my clump operator, and actually the shape maybe shouldn't be so sharp at the end, so we can just expand it a little bit. And we'll be playing with the shape a lot more. So this is one of the other tricks that I use when I'm making grooms, is that because I try to make them completely like created using this logic of the operators, I can go back and forth later on and make small adjustments, and they will be respected by the rest of the groom. So these small adjustments allow us to zero in on the final shape of the hair that's usually dictated by the reference. So here in the clump operator, I'm going to go down and I'm going to select add a special clump index channel. This will add a data channel to the hair. The data channel is, the channels are usually invisible unless you use the edit guides operator where you can visualize them. So the channel name can be the default value. And now I'm going to add another clump operator on top. And here, this is the new one. I'm going to go to this channel option here under region. And actually, you might need to cycle back and forth one time just so the value gets updated. You can see that we have the clump IDs channel. So I'm going to select this channel. There is still only one single clump for the hair, whole hair in the new operator, or rather, there are no clumps. And here we will use the randomly generated dynamic clumps, like I was saying before. So here I can increase, I have to increase the clump number beyond what we used for the coarse clumps. And you can see that now we have sub-clumping. So this sub-clumping essentially creates a bunch of smaller clumps inside of the bigger ones, like you have in the reference here, right? The clumps, sorry, I should not select clumps. The clumps generally, let me see the whole hair at the end and select geometry tool. So currently the hair looks something like this. You can still see that there is some work to do. And one of the things that I kind of want to change is that you see in this final hair, he has like more clumping here, less clumping there. The clumping is not exactly like in our case. The clumps are not exactly the same strength, the same size. The hairs get clumped differently on different parts of the hair. So what I can do here is I can randomize this by going to clump. I'm going to actually randomize this for both the dense and the sparse clumps. First, I'm going to do the sparse ones. If I go here, again, under the amount where we have the ramp for clumping, I can click on the none here next to the clump map and create a noise texture. A noise texture is going to allow us to vary the amount of clumping on the surface. So if I just hide my character bust, you can see that the scalp has a noise texture, and this noise texture drives the clumping amount. What I want to do is I want to keep the clumping, so I want to keep the high values as high. Or rather, I want to keep the low value as low and create some contrast. So the black parts here are going to be the parts where clumping is not going to be happening, and the rest will be clumped. So we're going to have some intermittent areas within our hair where clumping is less, and then others where clumping is more. So again, it's good to have this in place for now, and we can adjust the parameters and play around with this a little bit later. Like we can change the scale of the map, for example. And so I'm going to just repeat the same process for the sparse clumps. I'm going to assign a new map, a noise texture, and I'm going to make some places more clumped, you having more clumps, and other places having fewer clumps. So something like this to randomize the clumping. Now I can unhide my character again. And at this point, actually, maybe let's add some frizz to the hair. I already have it as one of the frequently used operators. By default, you're going to get a lot of frizz. Better reduce this value. And we can play again with the parameters, like the scale, for example. of the frizz. We can make it less or more frizzy. Again, this entirely depends on your reference. In some cases you want more, in some cases you want less. And you can also play with the outliers. So some of the hairs can have more frizz. You know, these are going to be this like little tiny hairs that are sticking out of the haircut. And you can control exactly what portion of the hair undergoes this transformation. So at this point, I'm going to switch to my ray traced view. Here it's kind of dark. So what we can do, like, because initially we only have the ambient light lighting the whole scene, what we can do here is enable two lights, optionally two lights. First light, I'm gonna click here. If I click and press on this light icon here, I can actually rotate the light around my character. Up and down rotates up and down, and left and right rotates around the character. Kind of like when you have a camera. So, and the back, we can also backlight, maybe use a different color for this light. So I'm gonna turn on the light. Just looking at the reference, he has a little bit of like a bluish hue, maybe a little bit of turquoise in the background. So something like this. And now we have a much better, more interesting representation of our hair. So as the next step, I think we can start to add a little bit more detail to the hair, or rather visualize it a little bit more detailed, so that we see the final result sooner and we're able to make small adjustments to it. So first thing is I'm going to go back to my change width operator and decrease the width of each strand from 0.05 to 0.02 to make them like more than twice as thick. And you can see the hairs became a lot thinner, right? And then I'm just going to tick the render mode to see the final hair. So all 100,000 hairs, which would be typical on head, you can preview here. So once you see the dense hair, it becomes a little bit more obvious. So the first problem for me is that all the lengths are the same. And this is why you get like clumps of hair abruptly ending like this. So what we can do is, actually, I'm going to keep the final hair and going to go back to my viewport so we can still see the kind of the overall shape of the hair and select my object. Here, I'm going to add a length operator, which will allow us to thin the hair a little bit, right? So I'm going to introduce a randomness. By default, it's 0%. I'm going to randomize it a little more. So now you don't have this abrupt ends, right? So in a reference, he doesn't have clumps of hair that are going together and then, you know, as if they were cut together at the end. The hair is thinned and strands have different thickness depending on their position. Also, here I can play a little bit more with the frizz. I think the scale is a little bit off, so let me just adjust the values. And I think the smaller clumps need to be a little bit more pronounced. Right now they're not clumped enough, so I'm just going to change the curve here to make them clumped a little bit more. And also let's introduce some of the strands that are not clumped, right? So the flyaways, both for the thin hairs and for the thick ones. So you see, as I change this percentage value here, it lets some of the hairs not be clumped, so it skips them. And this gives us some kind of like stray hairs that makes it a little bit more realistic. And I think if we go back to frizz, we can now decrease the outlier percentage because we have those other hairs that are just, they skipped clumping altogether. So now if we look at the result, it's a little bit more closer to the reference that we have. Maybe the color is actually a bit off. I think it's a bit more grayish. And by the way, don't forget to keep saving the scene. So I'm using Control-Alt-H to hold the scene once again. And at this point, I think I have enough operators to more or less do what we want. So I'm just gonna go back and play around with the parameters until it looks closer and closer to our reference image. So once I'm happy with the result, again, I'm going to Control Alt H to hold the scene, or I'm going to save it probably to a file. And I'm ready to export it. It didn't change from the last tutorial. It's very easy. Just go to File, Export, and you can use an Alembic mesh as an export, or you can export as a USD file, or you can alternatively just save this file as a OXZ format and reuse it inside Ornatrix in all of the host applications that we support. So 3ds Max, Maya, Unreal Engine, and Cinema 4D. You can also export this as a Graft Groom, which I demonstrated in an earlier tutorial. And I think actually maybe I'll make a follow-up to this tutorial to just show a little bit more about this groom panel over here, what it's for, what are graft grooms, and how can we really make this groom like super procedural and super user friendly for others to use. So stay tuned for that other tutorial. But for now, so one thing I forgot to show, actually maybe two things, is that first of all, it's you can switch to this cycles realistic render, right? If you go here and you select shading realistic, you can get a much better looking ray traced version of the hair using the cycles renderer. And second thing is whenever you save an Ornatrix groom file, it saves with a preview. Optionally, of course, you can go to settings and turn this off, but optionally you can save, it saves a thumbnail. So when you go to file and you start looking for grooms, you see, for example, here, you have a thumbnail preview. Or if I go to recent grooms, you can see that the grooms have a preview, right? So this is some of the earlier scenes I was testing with. So to generate this preview, it will do it automatically if you just have a perspective view. So it's going to just show you what you see right now. But you can actually set a custom thumbnail view. So if you go here to perspective, and here you select a thumbnail, and if you don't have this, you go to default views and thumbnail view. It's going to switch to a camera angle, which will be used to render the thumbnails of this scene. So for example, I'm going to align my character the way I like, that the way that it would look in the thumbnail. It actually shows me the square part of my viewport. So the darkened areas here are not going to appear at the end. And if now you see I have this file Timothee Chalamet in tutorial or .exe file, I'm going to save it. And then if I go to open file and try to look for it, you can see that it's saving with a nice thumbnail image. And so afterwards, I can switch back to my perspective view that I had before. And I can keep working the way I want. And that thumbnail view is always going to be used for the thumbnail image. So I'm going to save the scene. Actually, I'm going to upload it for you to see the final result and to be able to play with this groom and maybe even try to compare how you followed this tutorial to what I have here at the end. Maybe you did something better and maybe you have some tips that we could all use. Please post in the comments. And we're reading everything. And for the next tutorial, I'll try to bring anything that I missed up or show any new workflows that I have discovered. Again, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.